Okay, we're off. Okay. Right. Welcome to the first Conservative Home Fringe event at this year's Conservative Party conference. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and let me tell you what's going to happen next. I'm very pleased this is a meeting on housing. If you read Conservative Home, you'll know we think housing is one of the big three issues facing the country, and preoccupied in particular by the deleterious effect of the housing shortage in some parts of the country, the effect it has on starting a family, the effect on labour mobility, and the effect on growth. So no subject could be more important. I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one. They'll speak for about 5 minutes each. Then we'll be able to have a discussion for about an hour and a quarter. I'm sorry about the background noise, but there's a rule here that the better your marquee location is, and this is a fantastic one, the noisier it is, unfortunately, on the Sunday, so I can't do anything about that. So I have a difficulty in introducing our first speaker in that it's a bit of an Alice in Wonderland experience, because Lewis Sidney for NHBC used to organise our Fringe programme for year after year after year. So I'm very used to working with him. I still can't quite get used to seeing you, Lewis, here in this different capacity. But you're very welcome, and you have your 5 minutes or so starting now.
Thank you very much, Paul. I must say I'm relieved that I'm not involved now with your 35 Fringe events that you got in 2 days. So, but good luck. But it's a perfect event to kick off with, because housing, as Paul said, has really rocketed up the political agenda in the last few weeks with the stamp duty announcement. And it was interesting, last week at the Labour Party conference, Keir Starmer had a big chunk of his speech on housing. So it's clearly an issue that's going to dominate between now and I think the next election. For those of you who don't know NHBC, we work in the housing industry to provide a warranty, a 10-year warranty for new homes. So about 1.6 million homeowners have our 10-year warranty. And we also work to set construction standards. So we work with house builders, like on the panel, to support them to deliver high-quality new homes. And about 70% of all homes across the UK are built according to our technical standards. So a big role, an important role, and we're pleased to be here today at the conference. Just three very quick issues from me. I think clearly the market is on everyone's mind at the moment, with interest rate concerns and mortgage rate concerns really front and centre. And I guess it's going to be a big political issue up to the next election. There's 2 million homeowners that are currently on a mortgage that have to get a new mortgage between now and the election. So it's going to be a key issue. But on the supply side, from NHBC's perspective, 2022 has actually been a pretty good year. The number of new homes built, according to our data, have been strong. Quarter two, the last quarter that we have data for, there's a 45% increase in the number of new homes registered with NHBC compared to the same quarter the year before. So some actual good news, some good growth. August slowed down a little bit. There's about an 8-9% fall compared to July. So maybe a sign that the market is starting to enter slightly choppier grounds, but a really strong base. And it's also interesting to note within the supply side that at the start of COVID, about nearly a third of all homes that were built were flats, apartments, 27%. But now this has changed a little bit, and 16% in the last quarter of 2022 were flat. So some supply is looking positive, but maybe slowing down, and there's some different changes within the market that are very interesting as well. But I think if we're about to enter a very difficult period with supply, if things are going to get difficult, I think my second point is that we need to address some of the big structural problems within the market that have been here for quite some time. And one of those is clearly skills and young people, and trying to get more people into the house building industry and working in the sector. We run an organisation called the NHBC Foundation. It's our research arm, and it's gone into schools and done surveys. And if you speak to young people in skills and say, do you want to work in the construction industry? The numbers we have are like 8% say yes, we do. And if you speak to their mum and dads, the number's a little bit better. They'd like 15% in our latest data would like their children to work in the construction industry. But it's really low and really poor, and we have to improve the perception of career opportunities within the construction industry, because they're fantastic opportunities for young people to work in the sector. And we're trying to help with that. We do thousands of days of training each year at NHBC, and we're launching training hubs with house builders to try and get young people more interested and engaged in the sector. The other area and a structural issue is modern methods of construction. We've got the opportunity to build more homes more quickly and high quality through MMC. That's very low in the UK, but we at NHBC are trying to build more confidence into that process, and we've had over 11,000 homes built through MMC since the start of COVID, so it's heading in the right direction. So my last point, there's clearly the supply issues and structural issues in the market, but one thing I think we forget to do a lot, and it's interesting with the new minister to see his view on this. We all want more homes built, and we want to try and help people get on the housing ladder and own a home. But we often forget to talk up the housing industry, to talk up how good new homes are. Sometimes new homes get a bad press. I think the third thing that I wanted to say today is that we need to collectively talk up the benefits of new homes for young people, so they desire these products. They're high quality new homes. They have amazing customer satisfaction record. If you look at the data on how satisfied people are when they buy a new home, they're cheaper to run than older homes, and big issue now with the energy prices. They're greener, they're more environmentally friendly, they have a 10-year warranty like with NHBC. So lots of really good benefits, which is really getting the person outside wound up, but he doesn't like new homes maybe. But but there are these benefits, and I think we collectively need to talk more positively about new homes and collectively get that message out there. So I'm really delighted to be speaking today, delighted that the Minister could join us, and delighted that I'm not organising the event today. And thank you very much from me. Thank you.
Lewis, thank you very much. And next I'm going to go to Fiona Fletcher-Smith, who's the Group Chief Executive of L&Q, spearheading an investment programme to ensure the safety and quality of the Housing Association's 118,000 homes. So, Fiona, welcome.
Thank you, and I hope you can all hear me over that noise. Brilliant, excellent. So L&Q is a housing association that was founded in the mid-60s by some businessmen getting together with a member of the local church in Woolwich in South London, and for about £600 they were able to buy some homes for homeless people in that part of South London, and we've grown from strength to strength since. We are now a £39 billion charity, housing about 250,000 people from Preston down to the Medway towns in Kent, over to East Anglia and over to Reading in the west, but predominantly still a London and South East and urban Manchester-based association. We have been known in the past to be a major developer, and we still are. Last year we built 4,000 new homes. But since I took over about 2 years ago, we're really focusing on those existing homes that we have, those 250,000 people who make their homes with L&Q. And that is about investing in those homes, making sure that they meet the future home standards, making sure that they reach EPC level C, so that they're warm, safe and secure for residents. That is absolutely vital. And we plan to spend about £2.9 billion over the next decade on that sort of work. And the reason for that is that a home really matters to people. It's where people start their lives. It's where they can bring up families safely and securely. Educational attainment is improved by good homes, as are health outcomes. We reduce the burden on the NHS if people live in good, safe, quality homes. So we see building new homes as being fairly vital as well, and we will continue to build. I'll just finish with the 3 things that are keeping me awake at night, apart from, I think my hotel's quite close to that noise, so I could be losing some sleep generally. But the 3 things keeping me awake at night are inflation. So inflation, if I want to invest 2.9 billion, at the minute, amongst other things, many other things, that gives me 48,000 new kitchens. If inflation goes the wrong way, that won't be 48,000 kitchens, it'll be 40,000 kitchens, and our residents will lose out. The cost of living generally is deeply, deeply worrying for me. The average housing association resident has an income of 13 grand a year, and that is fixed. So how people are going to make ends meet during that period is really, really tough. And I'm already in discussion with local authorities about supporting warm hubs and potentially soup kitchens for our residents. And then the final thing keeping me awake is, been mentioned as well by Lewis, is around skills and our supply chain and skills within that. Construction is one thing. We've always suffered from a shortage of construction, and we haven't moved fast enough as a country to replace that labour that we lost once we Brexited. We need to really turn our attention to what we do on skills for construction. But for me, a subset of construction that's even harder to recruit to is repairs and maintenance. Getting people to work on the existing homes is even harder than getting people to work in construction. Because to work in a repairs and maintenance company, you also need to be pretty good at customer service, and that isn't always the case. So those are the three things keeping me awake. And hopefully this discussion today will help me get some ideas on how I get some sleep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually raised my voice a notch just to compete with whatever it is that's going on outside. As I introduce David Thomas, who's the Chief Executive of Barratt Developments plc. David, welcome here today, and away you go.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So just briefly, Barratt, we are the largest house builder in the UK. Last year we built around 18,000 homes. We've been in business for just over 60 years, and as a business we're very focused on and demonstrate a very good quality home, great customer service, and we're also very focused on being the most sustainable house builder. I think just to draw out some key areas, I won't kind of touch on everything because some of it's been touched on already, but I think access to land for house builders is a really key thing. And I understand, there's a debate about how much brownfield, how much greenfield. If you look back historically, Barratt back in 2007-8 was developing on about 75% of our completions were on brownfield land. So I think there's a really big opportunity at a local and national government level for there to be more cooperation around the development of brownfield sites. The second area is planning. I mean, we're not concerned about whether there's top-down targets or there's bottom-up targets. It makes little difference to us. The reality from our point of view is we need targets that people are going to stick with. And I think one of the realities of housing over the last 20 or 30 years has been a chopping and changing of what the targets are, and therefore output levels have never achieved any of the targets, which is the reality. In terms of planning, we clearly need to receive planning for us to get on site, and we can recognise that local authorities have got a huge pressure on in terms of their budgets and their ability to deal with planning applications on a timely basis. I think the industry has always shown itself willing to pay more in relation to planning. I mean, the reality is we can't operate without planning, and therefore performance agreements with local authorities is something that we welcome to try to ensure that we can get land through planning. But clearly planning is absolutely critical in terms of numbers. I think I won't touch on skills because it's been touched on before, but I would say that when you look at the transition for sustainability and green skills, I think this is a big opportunity for the industry. There's a lot to be done in terms of the way that we build homes and also the equipment we're putting into homes. So moving away from gas boilers to heat pumps, for example, which the industry will do in its entirety in 2026. So that transition is very important. It's very important that we develop those skills. I think also it's a real opportunity in terms of sustainability. I mean, we've touched on, if you want to touch on the costs of gas, the costs of electricity. And when you look at new build compared to, say, a comparable second-hand property, you're now looking at cost differentials that are in the order of £2,000 to £2,500 per annum. So new build, where everything we're building is EPC, energy performance rated, B or better. So like around 3% of the UK housing stock is B or better. There's a huge opportunity in terms of that transition, and I think it's an area where the mortgage providers need to really step up in terms of providing incentives for people to move into, to buy properties that are well rated from an energy performance perspective. So that's it by way of overview.
Thank you very much. And finally we come to Lee Rayleigh. And Lee, every year when I do a panel with you, you seem to have moved job, and so are able to say when you're asked about anything that you're still learning the ropes. And I expect to hear a certain amount for that for you today. Lee is, well, it's no secret he's down in my book as one of the really good ministers. And in introducing him, I'd also like to point out he is one of the original Red Wallers from 2017, where 4 or 5 seats, he'll know the exact number, that had traditionally been Labour, like his own one in North East Derbyshire, went Conservative. So he's a very good insight into that particular electoral demographic. Lee, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to bring the microphone closer because I've got a feeling I might need it in a minute if the noise starts going. Hello, everybody. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today, and thank you to Conservative Home for putting this on. As Paul indicates, I am going to caveat with 2 things. I am, I think, day 22 in the job, so forgive me if I don't have all of the technical knowledge that so many people on this panel in this room will have. And secondly, as you all know, the government is relatively new. The government is still announcing its policies, and therefore there is still an element of policy to come out. And so it may be that, unfortunately, I can't answer some of the elements which I know so many people in the room may be interested in, but I will try and do my best where I can. So the first thing I'm going to say is a truism. We need more houses. And the first thing, I think, if you go back to the question which we're debating today, how do you increase home building and home ownership, we've got to be straight with people. We've got to be clear that we need more houses. That will have implications. That will cause tensions. That will be difficult in certain places. I don't think that's revolutionary. I don't think it's news. But the implications, I think, we need to explain in more detail than perhaps we have done previously. When you have a situation where for the best part of 2 decades, your population and the way in which people form houses and households changes in a way that there is greater demand for households, and you don't build to that demand, you are going to get repercussions. You're going to get implications. And it's incumbent upon us to explain that, to accept it, and then to see what we can do about it. And I say that as somebody on a personal level in my part of the world, North East Derbyshire, who represents a 38% Greenbelt constituency, who understands the importance of planning and house building, and who has had his biggest wodge of his mailbox in the last 5 years has been about planning issues, because the previous Labour Council completely screwed up the planning system in my part of the world, and has about 1,000 more houses has been built in my patch than probably should be. So I understand and I accept the challenges that many of you will have in here. But the reality is we need more houses. We need them in the right place, but we need more houses. And so that's the first thing. One, we've got to be straight with people. We've got to explain people the trade-offs. We've got to be clear with people about the tensions. There's no point denying that. 2, I think my experience is, and this is all emerging, I'll come back in 6 months and tell you the view once I'm clearer from the housing portfolio. But the second one is we've got to treat people like adults. I think if you treat people like adults, if you talk to people about those tensions, about those trade-offs, about the fact that we do need to make sure that someone in their family is able to get on the housing ladder while still protecting their local village or their local town, I think most people will respond. I've been through loads and loads of planning processes. I've seen lots and lots of planning applications in. I've been through a really difficult set of local plans and an easier one. I've sat on a planning committee myself as a councillor. You can never please everybody all the time. If you want to do that, don't go into politics. But the vast majority of people in the middle will be reasonable when you set out the challenge and then you ask to take people along with you and you ask to really involve them in that discussion. And one of my experiences in North East Derbyshire, which for 30 years basically the group of people who were running that just didn't really involve residents. When you start going out there, it's hard, it's difficult, people are cynical at the beginning, but when you start having that conversation over time, repeatedly, about the challenges that are coming. People do want to work with you, and it won't be perfect, but I think it would be better than trying to ignore them and then hope for the best and shoving in a load of stuff which nobody likes in the first place. The third point, though, is if you're going to have that grown-up conversation, and we want to have that grown-up conversation on a local level, local areas can make decisions better than the man in Whitehall, particularly on acutely sensitive things like where you build houses. But if you're going to have that conversation, with rights come with responsibilities. And many of you who are councillors in this room will accept that, will acknowledge it, are doing your best to try and make that work, and I applaud you for that. But it is important that rights and responsibilities go hand in hand. If you have a right to think through where houses go, you have a responsibility to make sure plans go in place that are clear about where those houses go in the first place. And then fourthly, we need to work through how we align incentives. It's not that this discussion is completely mutually exclusive, that home ownership and giving the additional 20% of people who would ideally like to own their home but can't do, it's not that that's completely mutually exclusive with ensuring that we can protect the areas we need to protect, building good, well-designed houses and making sure we have strong communities. There is an overlap. We've got to try and get into that part of the Venn diagram. But if you take investment zones, for example, which has been part of a discussion in the last 20 days or so, which the Prime Minister has announced, that is an attempt to align incentives. It is saying to local areas, where do you want to do development? Where is there an area on housing, commerce, industry that you want to think through, and how can we help you do that? And I hope those kind of policies demonstrate a willingness by the government to try and find ways to bring together these things which are in tension and extremely difficult. We're never going to fix that, but if we can make them a bit better, then hopefully we'll have made progress.
Lee, thanks very much. Now we're going to have a bit of Q&A. I hope you don't mind if I start in this particular way. The 2019 Conservative Manifesto was not a particularly radical document, but it was quite radical on housing. It had some pretty radical housing proposals for liberalising planning and building more. Now, when your colleagues see this, they tend to translate this into, crudely speaking, building more family homes in Shire County seats near London. And you and I have both read the Hansard. Up pops Theresa May, Jeremy Hunt, Damien Green, the big figures in the Conservative Party, Bob Seeley in the Isle of Wight, the lot. And before you know it, any radical plan is completely dead in the water and doesn't move. So I suppose my question to everyone is, was it all just done wrong, and can it be moved with local consent? Or are your colleagues in certain areas, and actually from what you've said, pretty clearly North East Derbyshire's not immune from these pressures, are they just unwilling to vote through any significant reform, and we're all going to be here in 3 years' time having the same conversation? So who'd like to start? Yeah, Fiona.
I think Lee touched on it really. It's about how you work with the grain of a community and what are the incentives. Because if you come from Whitehall with a giant spaceship of a target and say we're going to build 10,000 homes in your county, people worry about access to a GP, where the kids are going to go to school. Can I get registered with a dentist? All of those things have to be thought about and worked out with the community. And I think when we talk about planning, we often forget that planning is a very critical part of a democratic process, and that you are elected as councillors to be part of that process. So that conversation with communities needs to happen, as well as understanding that there are about 8.4 million people in Britain inadequately housed in some way. Those are figures from the National Housing Federation just before the pandemic, so I can guarantee they aren't any better now. But you can't just impose it. It's got to be that communities together kind of conversation, about bottom up as well as some top down view of what the country needs as a whole.
And actually, David, if I could just take up Fiona's argument, it's a very familiar one. If you're going to do the development, you need the roads, you need the rails, you need the schools, you need the health clinics, you need the lot. I'd really ask two questions. One is, can you cite somewhere where this has all really worked, where you've had good local buying and you've had more housing? The second is a rather uncomfortable question. I mean, we're staring down the barrel at a massive series of reductions in the rate of public spending. Yeah? This is all coming, and it's coming soon. So given that, where's the money going to come from central or local government, to provide the kind of buy-in to which Fiona's just referred?
Okay, so well, it's always difficult to talk about specific places. It kind of upsets people. But I mean, I would say that if you look at an example over the last 20 years where it's worked well, I would say Milton Keynes. I think there's been fantastic focus and fantastic cooperation from the local authority in terms of housing development in that area. And that's been supplemented with, fast transport links into London, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of the funding, I mean, the reality is that house building itself creates a lot of value, I mean, not least through the 106 contributions. So I understand that things have to be funded, whether it be access to schools or access to hospitals or access to doctor surgeries. But the reality is house building itself gives that opportunity for funding to take place. The third point I would make, and I touched on it in my overview, I mean, I came into the industry in 2009. I think if you look at 50 years of housing in the UK, the reality is everyone's had really good ideas and they change every 3 or 4 years. And so there's no consistency in terms of delivery. So we've massively undersupplied the market. And we see on survey that homeowners will typically say they don't want houses built at the bottom of their garden or the bottom of their street, which I totally understand. But equally, homeowners will say, well, house prices are far too high, our children can't get onto the property ladder, and that isn't fair. So I think whatever the policies are, they have to be long-term, sustainable policies, or we'll just end up in failure in 5 years' time or 10 years' time.
Lewis?
Yeah, I would just say it's really encouraging to hear Lee talk about community engagement and bringing people together, because I think that's a key point. I think when you impose housing on communities, it creates problems. But when you bring people in and engage, and it's part of what I sell the benefits of housing and what it can bring to local areas, then it changes, it transforms people's minds and people's views. So I think that's encouraging. I think that's part of the solution. But it was a nice, easy question to start with from Paul, and over to Lee.
Well, I think if you take the example of my local plan in North East Derbyshire, that local plan was out of date in 2008, 2009. It was finally got in 2021. So somewhere between 2009 and 2021, you have pretty much open season. That makes people very, very, very cynical. And so if you want to avoid cynicism, they're the kind of things which we have to stop in the future. And now we've just got the local plan in place. I mean, I'm obviously not the councillor, but I've been encouraging our local council. Now we've got the plan in place, we don't all shut up shop and then disappear for 5, 6, 7 years and then think, oh, we now need to go out for a call for sites and then do all that kind of stuff. It's a continuous conversation about where things need to be and how things. So that's a sort of my point. I think if you talk to some of my colleagues, to Paul's question, they will feel extremely sensitive about this, quite rightly, because each of them have had, as you will all have done for those of you who are councillors or involved in your community, you each have had experiences, both good and bad, of the planning system. And the challenge is that we know where the problems are. Infrastructure doesn't come, it gets managed down halfway through the process. The densification doesn't happen in the right place. The discussion is at the wrong place because people get very worked up when they see requests for outline applications going up on lampposts saying we want to stick 400 houses down your road, and actually they realise that the principle of it has been half-seeded in the local plan discussion, which was 4 or 5 years before. So now nothing's ever going to be perfect in life. There's always going to be challenges. There's always an issue with communication, particularly when it doesn't impact this, you as an individual right now, but it's an issue in the future. But I think if we can find ways, or localities who already do a fantastic job, can find ways to keep that conversation going, and then on a macro level, on a policy level, we have to think about what we can do to address some of these broader, obviously very difficult questions, broader questions about infrastructure and densification, things like that. Some of the Levelling Up Bill is trying to do that. The infrastructure levy, for example, is looking at how you extract more support for infrastructure over the long term.
Okay, so now we'll go. I've seen John Moss and Richard Patient. I will go out. So, John.
Thank you, Paul. I'm a councillor in an outer London suburb. Fiona's got a big development in my patch. I'm not going to talk about that, Fiona. My council's trying to increase the number of homes in our borough by 30%. They're all flats, and they're all in tall buildings, even in the two-storey outer London suburban areas that I represent, along with my colleagues. My suggestion to you is the way the planning system works at the moment, the consultation we have is pointless. I've just gone through a consultation, pre-application consultation with a developer to build a 7-storey block with 72 flats and 3 parking spaces a mile from any of our railway stations. They haven't changed it one iota before they put the planning application in last week. Not one thing has changed. And when we suggested that it might be too high, it might need more parking, etc., they said, well, we're not going to change it. We've been through all that with the council for 2 years under the pre-planning advice application process, which is basically developers talking to councils behind closed doors. That should go. Pre-planning advice should be scrapped. And what should replace it is quite simple. It should be a consultation by the developer or land promoter prior to the preparation of an outline planning application, which then goes to the planning committee for approval or not. We should go back to what we had in the 90s and early noughties before the local development framework system came in under New Labour, because it worked. It was cheaper, it was quicker, and the developers, the land promoters, didn't put so much money out at risk, which meant that they were so invested in things they never changed them. So 2 suggestions for you. Scrap PPA, go back to outline planning applications.
Okay, right. Richard.
Hello, I run a company called Thorncliffe. I'm actually working in John's ward. I'm not sure whether that's the application you're referring about. And we also work with L&Q and Barrett. But actually, I want to talk about 2 issues. One is the SME sector, which the SME sector has fallen off a cliff in terms of development in the last 12 years. And I also want to talk about I want to ask questions about the 16 weeks. In my opinion, I don't think I've seen a single application that has been decided in that 16 weeks, despite planning performance agreements. And particularly for the SME sector, that is disastrous. So SME sector and the timing, please.
Fine. Okay, so who wants to... Lee?
Sure. Thank you for all the comments. On the pre-planning advice, I mean, I will take that back. I'll have a think about that one. The point which I would agree with you is on consultation. We're never going to get all of this right. There's always going to be challenges. You have to have sufficient flex in the system to make sure it works in all or in most situations. But I do accept this challenge about if consultation isn't meaningful or isn't perceived to be meaningful from the community, then that's what breeds cynicism over the long term and makes it twice as difficult next time you want to have a difficult conversation. How that works, I need to have a think about. We need to have a think about. But I get the point that you're making. On the point about the SME sector, you're absolutely right. The amount of housing built on SMEs has gone significantly down since the global financial crisis. It's now, I think, about less than 10%. And it's a difficult one to see easy levers to pull, because of course we want a market which has a distributed and diverse group of people who are building. There's a clearly high barrier to entry, particularly in terms of the length of time it takes to realise the investment and things like that. So that is something which I know historically there's been some attempts to try and look at what can be done. I'm interested in people's views around that for the long term. And then in terms of processes and in terms of delays, one of the things which I'm going to try and look at across the board, question exactly what it is I need to work through, is speed in general. You know, the reality on a lot of this is that there is a challenge with time and how long it takes, and so a lot of that, you know, due process is extremely important, but equally we want to make sure we've got the balance right on all of that.
Okay, David, pre-planning advice or SMEs?
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I can do both.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think with SMEs, I mean, I agree that SMEs have dropped substantially since the financial crisis, but the reality is that if you go back to the early 70s, there was no house builder in the UK doing more than 2,000 units, no individual house builder. So, I think you could compare it to supermarkets and corner shops, or you could compare it to petrol retailing, and the reality is the landscape has changed dramatically. And in both those areas, supermarkets and petrol retailing, there's big players and there's far less small players in the marketplace because of the complexity of regulation, the complexity of planning, etc., etc. So whilst we welcome SMEs, we cooperate with SMEs. We've shared a lot with regard to SMEs in terms of, for example, the future home standards and what's required to be done in terms of sustainability and so on. But the reality is you're not going to bring SMEs back in the numbers that they were in 12 years ago or 20 years ago. In terms of planning, I think it's a law of unintended consequences. So really the intended consequence was that planning would be measured and that there would be KPIs and the planning departments would be reported on, and therefore there's a 13-week planning period which is reported on as a measure of the success of the planning department. But the reality is all that's happened is that prior to that commencement of that KPI, we now have pre-application protocols, and you can spend a year in pre-application, which isn't part of the KPI. And then prior to us commencing on site, we have sites which are again outside the KPI period where we might have 200 conditions to discharge, and we can't get onto site, although we've got planning, until we've discharged those conditions. So the reality is the whole planning process has to be looked at, because we've gone from a situation where you could go end to end in the late 80s in 12 weeks to now going end to end in 12 months.
Lewis.
Yeah, just on the SME point, I think NHBC, we track the number and size of builders in the market, and as David said, a lot of them left the market in 2008, 2009, and they haven't returned to the market. It is a regulatory problem. The burdens on smaller builders to build in today's climate is very high, and there are some policies coming through which you may not have seen yet, but will have the unintended consequence of being very tough on smaller builders. So I think we need to look at that and understand some of these policies have a positive objective but can have severe unintended consequences and undermine the market more broadly. So it's a key point. I think it's good that Richard raised it. I know he's an expert in this area, so thank you for raising that.
Fiona, anything? Or?
Just a couple of quick points. I think one of the things we've got to remember on planning is resourcing the local authority planning teams properly so that they're able to deal with all of this. I lose lots of money every year on planning applications, which is mostly down to lack of resource in the local authority, because when you're trying to make ends meet, paying for planning policy people is not going to be high on your agenda. The other thing, just to say something positive on SMEs, on the going to the market recently for our £2.9 billion investment programme, we have a significant number of small and micro businesses will be part of that supply chain. So it's not all doom and gloom. Thank you.
Okay. Lots of hands. Gentleman in the blue shirt there, and the lady there.
Thank you. Good afternoon. One of the things that if you want to really speed up is stop what is in the pipeline being held up by government departments in particular and the JR system. If you were to cut out a whole lot of that, then a whole mass of what is waiting to be done could come forward.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm a councillor involved with the local plan working group. I represent a rural constituency in East Anglia. My challenge for you house builders is, could you please build some bungalows, some more age-appropriate accommodation for the elderly, for people who are using wheelchairs. My villages are Type B villages. They can't actually build anything new. Yet there are people who live in very large family homes who are the only person left. They want to stay in their community or nearby, and there's no accommodation for an elderly person. We don't all want your nice 4-bed houses with garage and a drive in a big town. Some of us actually like living in rural England, and we want to be able to do that, but we need some sensitive suggestions from the house builders, because it's always little boxes for families or flats. And actually, older people would like a bit of a garden. It's not unreasonable. And they'd like to give up their big house for the family who wants to expand into it.
Okay, right. So who wants to come in on age-appropriate accommodation and JR? David, since the last one was addressed at you.
Yes. I would much rather do that one than JR. So, if you go back a number of years ago, 15 years ago, Barratt had a retirement housing division. And I think you touched on it. What you've seen happen with the market is the market for retirement housing has become a market for retirement apartments, not for retirement housing. What we find is that, this is just our experience, is that if we provide a range of houses from 2-bedroom to 5-bedroom homes, we get plenty of customers who are retiring, but would prefer to retire into a private housing development rather than to retire into a specific retirement provision. I think the second point in terms of bungalows, I mean, we still see a lot of applications that will go through local authorities where the local authority will insist on the provision of bungalows. So that's very much part of the planning discussion as to what, if the local authority has any specific requirements in relation to provision.
Right, anyone else on either of those points? No? Okay, fine. Right, well, just can I ask, I'm going to exactly urge you all to shout as loudly as the people outside, but do make sure we can hear you. And next, it'd be actually quite useful if you said who you are and where you come from. So I'm going to take the lady there with a hand, and the gentleman there in the green shirt.
I'm not a councillor, I'm a member, but nobody's mentioning the reason for the lack of housing supply is because we're getting too many people. If we continually have, I think, 1 million, legal migrants last year, they've all got to live somewhere. We're getting tens of thousands of illegal migrants, they've all got to live somewhere. Unless you get a grip on this, you're not going to win the next election. That's the reality. And that's why people can't get a doctor's appointment, people can't get a dentist, because it's too much pressure of numbers. I had a conversation with my doctor who's left my practice because he said, I can't look after my patients because there's too many people and not enough doctors. It's exactly the same. Too many people, not enough places to live. So stop the pressure, stop the customers, halt immigration so we don't have the continual pressure on housing.
Right, and the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. We've talked about incentives a bit, and we've also talked about community incentives.
Who are you, please?
Oh, sorry, James Dixon here from West Ham. So you'll recognise L&Q has some bits around there, right? The point was incentives have been touched on, community consent has been touched on. Section 106 and maybe community infrastructure levies, we have those as existing ways to bring some money into people that might otherwise oppose those developments. Is the view of the panel that that is sufficient? Is it badly communicated maybe in instances where it doesn't convince communities to approve of plans? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, okay, so who wants to do the second question first? Anyone? Fiona, yeah.
Goodness, they really seem to be reaching a crescendo out there. It's noise. Actually, noise is quite stressful, isn't it? So on your second point, are the incentives sufficient? Probably not, but we've got to balance so much. We've got to balance the cost of building with the various asks of a development and a developer. I do think it's something that needs to be looked at a local level to make sure that the right ask is being made. I spent a lot of time with London boroughs who would constantly ask for public art or a community centre to be built next door to an existing community centre when the first community centre had no revenue to keep going. So you've got to work it out at a local level, what you need as a community. And then I think you find most of us, David and I particularly, be very open to a conversation about what those incentives are and how we can make it better.
Okay, on the immigration question, Lee, can I turn to you, because there seem to me to be two elements to it, if I didn't misunderstand the questioner. One was there's the whole small boats question, and whether anything really is going to be done about it, given the propensity of people to go to the courts and the courts to make decisions. And the second actually was about the legal numbers, where we read that the government, in some respects, actually wants to take restrictions off.
Well, there's obviously a balance, and this is slightly beyond my purview, in that this is moving more towards the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and I will probably limit my comments to some extent as a result of that. To your question about illegal immigration, it's very simple to me. We have to stop the boats, full stop. The boats have to be stopped. And I know Suella Braverman is working extremely hard for that to happen. When I speak to my constituents in North East Derbyshire, the biggest issue apart from cost of living is immigration. They want clarity that we have the ability to control our borders and that we are able to make decisions about who comes here, when they come, and the manner in which they arrive. Once you have that clarity, I think you can have a better conversation with people and with the UK as a whole about what immigration means, the benefits it brings, and the things that it has done for our communities and our country over the long term. But that's a Home Office lead, so I'm going to let the Home Office lead on that. But the reality is that all policies are interlinked. And so from a homes perspective, from a housing perspective, if you have both an increase in population as we have had, and you have a different dynamic around how people are forming households, the proportion of households that have a smaller number of people in them has increased in recent years, that creates additional demand. And that's what I'm trying to look at within housing, but I accept it all links together.
Okay, so next we got masses and masses of hands. I don't know where to start. So I'm going to take the gentleman right in the corner. You, and then someone else from somewhere. The lady right at the back, who I'm pointing at now. Yeah. Do remember to speak up and give your name. Yep.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Cronk. I represent Landspeed Homes. We are one of the rare SMEs. We specialize in the creation of and delivery of affordable homes for ownership. So I've been very interested to hear a number of the points that have been raised by the members of the panel. I mean, David, you mentioned one word in particular, consistency. And Fiona, you mentioned another aspect, which is local needs. Both of those are hugely important in determining the delivery of affordable housing, which for the most part is under Section 106. I'd like to say at this point that we deliver across the board. So we create housing which is for first-time buyers, for family accommodation, and what is often referred to as last-time buyers, so also bungalows. But specifically, we are meeting a local need. So this is something that's been determined on a local level. My concern with some of the direction of travel in recent years with affordable housing policy generally has been some of the policies that have been handed down by central government that are all-encompassing. I mean, we started under the Cameron administration with starter homes, which I think we can all accept was an abject failure, but the sentiment was perhaps right. And we're now struggling with a similar situation with first homes, which is a prescriptive diktat to...
Probably, if I ask for questions, rather than you're in the middle of quite a long speech. So could we have a question? Because lots of other people want to get in.
Fine. My question is, will the Secretary of State reconsider the central government push for taking over affordable housing obligations and allow it to return to a local needs?
Okay. And it was the lady there. Yep.
Thank you very much. Alexandra Joseph from Bright Blue. My question relates to MMC, probably directed at Lee and David, if I may, just to get your opinion on how you see that playing a role in the future in answering the first part of the question.
Okay. So, Lee.
Sure. On the first question, I noted your concern around that. When we're all new in post. We're looking at all aspects of that. I wouldn't read anything in or read anything out, but in due course, we will go through that. I've only been briefed on first homes a couple of days ago, and that's a pilot, so we're effectively seeing what comes from that. But I understand your point you're making. In terms of modern methods of construction, has the potential to be hugely influential if done correctly. But equally, we've got to make sure it's done correctly. So we've got to ensure both that we are taking steady and cautious and careful steps to how they're used. We build a market which works for it, and then ultimately the infrastructure around methods of modern construction can come. I was in Milton Keynes, talking about Milton Keynes, I was in Milton Keynes on Thursday with Homes England, who were demonstrating both from an SME perspective, and they were ring fencing part of their geography that they have in Milton Keynes specifically for SME builders in the southeast, so that they have a greater opportunity to build. But equally, we were looking at MMC builds, which look great. And we need to try and encourage that where it's appropriate. But equally, they were telling me about the current challenges, that some of the factories are now the other side of the country. So actually getting the things moved across the country is really challenging. So I think MNC has a huge part to play. And if we can take it steadily and carefully and build that market over time, it could have real implications to the positive.
Anyone else on the affordable? Yeah, Lewis.
Just on the MMC point, really encouraging to hear what the Minister just said about it playing a really big role in the future, and we're trying hard to up the pace on this as well. And I mentioned 11,000 homes have been through the NHBC Accepts scheme, which is trying to give confidence in MMC, and it's a really important area, so that's really, really positive to hear that.
To some extent, just to echo what the Minister said, but we spent quite a lot of time in 2018 trialling different methods of construction. And then we opened a factory in Scotland, and we're going to open a new factory in England in 2023. So we're seeing more and more of our production adopting modern methods of construction. And I think it's key to what we're doing both from a quality perspective, but also what we're doing from a sustainability perspective going forward.
Right, okay, we have two more. We'll have gentlemen at the front, and you in the blue shirt. Yeah.
Tom Wrigglesworth, Leeds Building Society. We were the largest shared ownership lender in the country and one of the first providers of first homes, so affordable homes schemes, quite important to us. I've noticed a lot of speculation around the affordable homes programme and whether that's secure, and also whether investment zones will have affordable housing schemes as part of the reduction in regulation, whether that's something that's secure. I'd like to ask if there's a guarantee on either of those that you could make.
Okay, and yeah. And where was that? Yeah, there we go.
Hi, there's Tom Cooper at Cheshire West and Chester. There's a priority agreement of a priority for brownfield development, yet the biodiversity net gain requirements have the perverse effect of prejudicing against brownfield developments, because brownfield sites have often, when they've been left to run wild, the requirements to achieve biodiversity net gain on a brownfield site is often greater than on a greenfield suburban development, which pushes developers away from the brownfield sites that we need to develop. Will the Minister consider some sort of exemption or lower standard requirements for biodiversity net gain on brownfield sites?
So.
Great. Well, this is the part of the conversation where I go, I'm 2.5 weeks in, and therefore I'll take all of your views and have a look at them. But I mean that seriously, in that, in a normal non-political, I was in the private sector for 15 years, in a normal non-political job, you would take 3 to 6 months to work out what you were doing and how you were doing it. You would create a strategy. That's not how politics works, and I know you know that, I know that. So, but if you forgive me, I will probably hesitate to answer some of those things directly, other than to say both they are understood, they will be looked at, and we will come out in due course with that. I was only looking at the affordable housing programme a couple of days ago. Brownfield and the Brownfield funds, which have been announced already, are also in my box this weekend. And just on investment zones, I probably can say a little bit more about that. The point of investment zones is optionality. The whole principle behind them is that local areas make a decision, one, about whether they want to bid for them, and then two, if they do, where they want to bid for them, what is the area they want to bid for, and then three, if it's acceptable, if it works, if it gets through the process, which was published this morning in terms of the expression of interest, if that happens, then we work together as a partnership to try and speed up what local areas want to do, and to see what government can do to try and get to that point as quickly as it possibly can be. But if you look at the investment zone publication, which was done this morning, there is a substantial amount of comfort, I hope, in there about the importance of the retention of habitats and biodiversity and things like that. So hopefully you can see with the detail that's coming out the intention of the government and direction of travel.
Anything else on either of those two? David?
Well, just to add, I mean, I would agree with what you say with regard to brownfield sites, and I think perhaps it seems slightly contradictory, but the reality is a lot of greenfield sites have relatively little biodiversity credentials. For example, farmers' fields, relative to a brownfield site. But I would say that I think at a 10% level, it is still attainable. However, as we move forward, I'm sure that the regulation will demand more than 10%, and therefore I think that that's where there's scope for there to be differentiation between brown and greenfield.
Okay, right. So, who else have we got? That gentleman there in the green tie and the guy in the pink shirt here.
Thank you. Aidy Riggott from Lancashire County Council. I wanted to touch upon the incentives for district councils, something we haven't talked about today. Lancashire, as I'm sure the Minister will know, has a Conservative-run county council, has a whole swathe of new MPs, definitely backing this agenda of building new homes, but we have the legacy of district councils who were Labour-run, who are now in no overall control, holding back the delivery of this agenda because they don't buy into national government policy. So, is the Minister considering incentives for district councils to bring forward housing delivery promptly, like how new homes bonus used to work, etc.?
Okay, and Sir.
Hello, Harry Rushworth. I'm a young member from London. Good to see the whole panel supports more home construction. Mentioned earlier, Paul, at the start, the panic around the shires of more house building there, but that's a symptom of the critical shortages in urban areas like central London. So my question is, what place does urban infill and densification play in increasing home ownership in the future? And particularly, how can we get local communities buy-in?
So, I mean, this is getting repetitive, but Lee, the first question is for you. So I'm going to turn it on you again and then ask anyone else who wants to come in on the second about urban. Oh, yeah, but so Lee.
Sure. So in terms of the question about the interaction between district councils and county councils and within the planning system, I mean, obviously, because I'm the planning minister, I can't talk about individual areas. So, but on a general point, that is something that we're going to look at. There will be more information that comes through in due course, but it's not something I can really talk about now, unfortunately. Sorry to not give a great answer on that.
That's all right. Anyone on district councils or urban densification?
Do urban densification?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, a great question about densification. Yeah, the urban areas need more homes. At L&Q, we specialise in the urban, but the densification's got to be done right. It's got to be done properly. It's got to have the right amount of green space, play space, access to nature around it. And what's the incentive for people? It's got to be back to infrastructure, and infrastructure in its widest sense. It is the GPs, the schools, the dentists, where are you going to shop, how are you going to get around, and all of that has got to be thought about. You know, my experience from years ago working in Dublin, where we built huge suburban developments in places like Tala and Clondalkin, without churches, without schools, without shops. Utterly disastrous. Very dense, very urban, but nowhere you'd want to live.
Okay, fine. I'm going to take three more. I've got to strike a balance between the hands going up and the number of empty chairs. So I'm going to take three last ones. I'm going to take the lady there, there, and there. Yeah.
Thank you. Beverly Connolly from Tantridge in East Surrey. Not very many people have mentioned the elephant in the room, which is the green belt. We have in Tantridge 94% green belt. Our council is run by independents. They are stymieing any development. And I mean, Fiona, you were talking about doctors, nurses. The people can't afford to live there because there are no homes that they can afford. So Tantridge is going to be a place populated by people that can afford to live there because of the higher cost of housing, and elderly people that have lived there for years. There's no young families that can afford to live there. There's no, essential workers that can afford to live there. And so I would say for the Greenbelt issue, you say that the man in the street should make the decisions. Well, I don't agree with that, because in Tandridge, no one's going to agree with development. So I think, you know, that the government should be making the decisions. I mean, our planning department, we were talking about planning, is a toxic mess. It has 250 applications outstanding because the independents, again, try to stymie all the development. You talk about the small, medium construction businesses. Yes, in Tandridge, they are truly challenged because every application they put in is stymied by the independents. So we have a huge problem in Tandridge with development. We have a huge problem with housing. And I think that's something, when there is Greenbelt, that government should be deciding on, that government should be saying, look, you have to accept this level of housing, because otherwise we're just not going to get it. And that's, you know, so that's my question to the Minister. What are you going to do? Because I think in some areas, Greenbelt is a luxury we can't afford because we need to house people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Ben Flatman from Building Design. My question is about the government's seeming inability to develop a long-term strategic partnership with the construction industry. I think, Lee, you're the fourth housing minister, or fourth minister in your role this year, and seventh in the last 4 years. Sir James Waits, chairman of the Waits Group, recently expressed sort of extreme frustration with the constant chopping and changing. I think David Thomas has also expressed frustration with the shifting targets and just the sense that government doesn't give the priority to the construction industry that it deserves. Sir James Waits has called for a very senior ministerial position in government dedicated to construction, with an incentive for that minister to stay in post more than 3 months.
And then finally, yeah.
I'm from London and I'm a property investor. I'm investing here in Birmingham on a buy-to-let basis. Now, I'm kind of a little bit concerned about what's going on at entry level in the investing, because it's great to see people like yourselves getting together and having a discussion, but you're missing the bottom end of the market where there's people like myself and smaller builders who are investing in the industry, but we haven't got a means of getting bigger and helping that supply. The government's squeezing the buy-to-lets, providing rentals through the Section 24 tax, and also the EPC. The Section 24, I can understand. The EPC, to a certain standard, is necessary, with also kicking back on the rogue landlords, which really do need to exit the industry. Instead, there's a lot more regular landlords who are providing things at quality standards, who are exiting the industry as well. But there's also the smaller town builders who might not be quite as big as yourselves. They're starting out in their own businesses and they want to provide that housing, but maybe they can't get hold of the finance and they can't contribute to the supply.
Okay, right. I'm going to come to the Minister last, but anyone else on either of those three? And I must say, I was particularly struck by the first two, one of which was about the sheer rapidity of the turnover of politicians, and the other of which basically said, right, central government should act and just build on the green belt, and that's that. So who, Lewis?
No, your point about the number of ministers, I hope there isn't change quickly now as well. I'm sure you do too, because it has been quite remarkable in the housing sector. But I think, I disagree a little bit with what you said about the priority. I think Liz Truss has signified very early in her premiership that housing is a top issue with her, and already introduced big policy on stamp duty. So it looks like a core priority and will get the attention of central government.
Yeah, Tina.
So, just a little word on the green belt. I mean, Tandridge is a beautiful place, but I do think, and I've made this point to both Boris when he was London Mayor and to the current London Mayor, there needs to be some better thinking about London's green belt, because it isn't this bucolic, gorgeous place that you take the kids for a picnic. There's parts of the green belt at Enfield that are not fit for humans to walk on because of the runoff from the M25. So we need to have it is okay to have a conversation about the green belts. It doesn't mean you're going to build all over it, but at least have a conversation, Mayor. There you go.
David.
Well, I think it would just make the point, I mean, I said earlier that we're probably indifferent in terms of local or national targets, but I think clearly there can't be no development in areas, and therefore ultimately there's got to be some minimum target set, otherwise certain areas will just develop nothing.
Lee, I mean, one of those questions about the turnover of ministers is like kind of a bit beyond your pay grade, right? Another one, the one from the lady there, was it was an invitation to have a rather invigorating conversation with some of your colleagues. So the last word is with you.
Thank you. Well, just taking in turn, on the buy-to-let, my colleague Andrew Stevenson is looking at the rental market, but I will speak to him and I will pass on the points. And then on the buy-to-let specific elements, I have certainly noted those in terms of future policy design. Obviously, some element of that is with the Treasury, so I can't comment, but understood and noted. In terms of Greenbelt, this is obviously an extremely sensitive issue. I am 38% Greenbelt myself. I know how important it is. I know how important it is for many people. Ultimately, where I probably would probably part ways a little bit is I do think if you can structure the processes in the right way, you will get most people doing the right thing most of the time. There will always be examples at either end of a ledger which are challenging, but the reality is if you can get most people doing the right thing for most of the time, then that's probably where it needs to be. But to your point about where people at one end of the ledger aren't doing the right thing, as I said at the beginning, with rights come responsibilities. With the need to make local decisions comes a responsibility to ensure those decisions are made. And then finally, on my future career prospects or not, I would very much like the opportunity to be able to stick around, and I'm keen to do so, and I will seek to do everything within my power to do that. But just in terms of construction, I was the construction minister for a year prior to this. So I hope I bring to this role an understanding of that element of the sector. And we work very closely with the Construction Leadership Council and with a number of other parts of the sector and the industry to understand both some of the skills issues over the long term, but also some of the challenges and opportunities within that. So I hope I can bring some of that over the fence into DLUC in the coming months ahead.
Look, it's been a fascinating conversation and key issues. Just three lots of thanks very quickly to David, Fiona, Lewis and Lee. To our friends with the microphones who've had to carry them around battling with the noise. And actually, last but not least, to all of you for sticking it out for the hour or so, despite the noises off. Thank you all very much.